Hello, ako si Judas Cavillan. Kayo ay nanonood ng bagong episode ng Newsbreak Beyond the Stories kung saan hihimayin natin ang mga maiinit at mahalagang issue sa Pilipinas. Sa episode na to, pag-uusapan natin ang tensyon sa pagitan ng Taiwan at China. Inihayag kamakailan ng China ang kanilang planong military deals malapit sa Taiwan. Dagdag ito sa mas lumalaking presensya ng China sa region. Dahil sa lumalalang tensyon, tanong ng marami, paano ito maapektuhan ang Pilipinas? At paano nga ba dapat rumesponde ang gobyerno dito? Sagutin natin ang mga tanong na to kasama si Sofia Tomacruz, ang foreign affairs reporter ng Rappler. Hi Sofia, thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Judas. Thanks for having me again.
So bago tayo magsimula, I would like to remind our audience na pwede silang magtanong. Just comment down below and try our best to answer your question. Sofia, let's begin Paano nga ba nagsimula ang gulo na ito sa pagitan ng China at Taiwan? Ano nga
Mhm.
ba ang dahilan kung bakit inaangkin ng China ang Taiwan?
Sige, so balikan natin yung nangyari nung August 3, no? Recent tensions really started with the visit of US Speaker Nancy Pelosi to the island. But before that, I mean, that was the most recent event that really sparked the level of tension that we're seeing right now. But even before that, we can say that tensions were simmering. And I think 2020 is an important year to look at, no? Because this is when what happened in 2020. Of course, that's when the pandemic broke out, no? And this is really when Taiwan's profile was sort of rising in the international community, because we saw so many countries saw how successful um, Taiwan was when it was combating COVID-19. It raised the alarm on possible human to human transmission. And so, um, all those things raised the island's profile. And of course, they also had high profile support from the US, among other things. And that's really what of course that wasn't acceptable to Beijing because that would bolster its sense of independence.
Mhm.
And so in the context of sorry, just to mention no, just to mention a brief point about the support from the US. There was growing support from the US for Taiwan, and for you could see this in different activities. No, so for example, in 2020, when we're looking at that year, the former Health Secretary Alex Azar visited Taiwan, and he was the highest ranking US government official to visit the island at that time in more than 40 years. So all these developments, of course, are unacceptable to Beijing, which claims Taiwan. And Taiwan's profile rising in the international community, of course, is seen as a problem because they have these claims over Taiwan. And back then, Beijing was already responding with um, anger and a show of force. That's when they were ramping up military drills, and I think what really made the news at the time in relation to these military drills were the incursions into Taiwanese airspace. And so, even if Nancy Pelosi's visit was the most recent thing that sparked this level of tension, no, there has always been a slow, steady increase in the activities that we're really just seeing, happening on a different level right now.
Yeah. Uh, Parang when I think of Taiwan, like before the pandemic, uh, sobrang siguro mababaw, but natatawa ako sa kanilang Ministry of Foreign Affairs Twitter. Sobrang makikita mo dun pa lang sa social media nila na strong stand sila against China. Hindi sila talaga nag-hold back when they condemn whatever China is doing over the past years. Sa anong pinangahawakan nila or sa sila humuhugot considering that there's a small island compared
Mm,
to China na superpower.
yeah, yeah.
Over the years talaga malakas sila, no? So parang where does they come from?
Yeah, well, yeah, good question, no. And
Yeah.
really the this conflict between China and Taiwan, and Taiwan seeing itself as its own state, its own country, and China seeing Taiwan as a part of it. It's partly rooted in the late 40s now when civil war erupted in China. And that civil war was between the forces of Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong's Communist Party. So of course that the communists won and they took control of Beijing, which is the seat of
Mhm.
power. And Chiang Kai-shek is that's when Chiang Kai-shek national party, known as the Kuomintang, that's when they left and fled to Taiwan. And that's in Taiwan is where they ruled for several decades. So in
Mm,
the eyes of China, they see Taiwan as this breakaway province that will
mm,
eventually be under its control again. But Taiwan sees itself as distinct from
mm,
China, with its own leaders who are elected by the public, its own laws, its own constitution. And
mm,
so that's kind of where the tension is, no?
yeah,
But in just going back a little bit to, well, going forward rather to where we are now, um Chinese President Xi Jinping has more openly and more explicitly talked about reunification with Taiwan and how it's
mm,
a non-negotiable
yeah,
for China. So, and as we've seen, no, in recent weeks and years, the use of force is not impossible for this
yeah.
to happen.
Yes. You mentioned nga talaga that talagang when you gave the context, so historical context, malaki yung parang hugot ng China sa gusto ng mangyari. Malaki rin yung pinangahawakan ng Taiwan kaya sila lumalaban sa China. Itong pagbisita ni US Speaker Nancy Pelosi recently sa Taiwan, and then I think past weekend,
Mhm.
may mga legislators din from US na pumunta rin. I think apat sila, no? It's taga sa highlight kasi the highest level of government official from US pumunta dito. What do you think this signals? Will this be a new era for Taiwan-China strain?
Well, I think multiple factors are at play, no? So, um, if it's a new era, you can say that in a way because um multiple factors are at play, and it might be a new year in the sense that there's a lot of important developments that are happening right now, no, in this year. So for
Yeah.
example, um there's a party congress, the meeting of the party congress in China happening later on this year, where Chinese President Xi Jinping is expected to have to extend into a third term. So that's pretty unprecedented because usually, um before for Chinese leaders before who came before Chinese President Xi Jinping, usually it was around, they would usually occupy or take control for around 2 terms. And so now Xi Jinping is trying um to gather support for a third term, right? So that would be a break from that. And in a way that could usher in a new era, because this
Mm-mm.
is the kind of stand that China has taken under President Xi Jinping. And so were he to stay in power longer, and it's pretty much, I mean, you read the news and you read stories about the leadership, it's pretty much I would say a foregone conclusion
Yeah.
that there is going to be a third term um for Xi Jinping. And so you can say it's ushering in a new era. Although at the same time, this has always been how it's like, right, under
Yeah.
him. So I think it's more just this is the new era. This level of tension and this level of volatility, perhaps, is what we could expect to become, quote unquote, new normal.
Yeah.
Even Singaporean president mentioned a few weeks ago that he sees the world coming into a more challenging, um he says darker clouds are hanging over the
Mm.
global landscape, and that's what people and countries should be prepared for.
Yeah. So, from the outside the country, punta naman tayo ngayon sa Pilipinas, Sofia, no? Kamusta bang relations ng bansa natin sa Taiwan? I know, di ba, siguro on the surface level, I know technically walang, formally speaking, walang embassy ang Taiwan sa Pilipinas.
Mhm.
How would you describe yung relations ng dalawang lugar na to?
Well, our relations with Taiwan are pretty similar to a lot of countries. The Philippines abides by a one China policy. And so that means that we don't have formal relations with Taiwan. That means we don't have an embassy there. We don't have an ambassador there. What we do have are cultural or representatives. So if you
Mm.
know the offices like, MECO,
Yeah.
Manila, yeah, or TECO, Taiwan Economic Cultural Office. That's the relationship we have, because we have economic and cultural relations with them, but we don't have formal diplomatic relations, like again on the level of the ambassador and having an embassy there. So
Yeah.
that's it's pretty similar to a lot of other countries now, which established formal relations with China, and for that to have happened in the 70s, you had
Yeah.
to, at the bare minimum, recognize the one China policy, which I mean
Mhm.
abide by the one China policy, which sees you recognize the government in Beijing, so the People's Republic of China, as the legitimate government, and by doing that, you downgrade ties with Taiwan.
Yeah. So parang naging parang prerequisite for any relationship with China,
Hmm.
formal relationship, to acknowledge the one China policy.
Yeah,
And but
but
are
it's
there
not.
countries that sorry.
Yeah, it's not just the Philippines. Yeah, it's
Yeah, yeah, that is.
majority of the countries. Yeah.
But are there countries that refuse to acknowledge this?
Yeah, there are around 13 countries. I won't list all of them because there are 13 nga.
Yeah.
But then yeah, including the Vatican. So there are countries that don't abide by the one China policy.
And these are because they have strained relationship with China, or they never formally acknowledge a relationship with China.
They never form it, so they never formally,
Mm.
yeah, they never formally abided by the one China policy, and that means they never recognized the People's Republic of China as the sole legitimate government.
Okay, sige. So with what's happening now na medyo 'di ba nga we see China as a global superpower, but at the same time we see its negative effect encroaching the territories, or sabotaging the economy of many countries, like as we see with its loans, like we see it in Sri Lanka, for example. Maaari ba natin makita near ang near, or maybe sooner or later, or in the future, ang end of one China policy?
uh Mahirap yung tanong na yun because then we get into making predictions, no? But I
Yeah.
think I don't think so. I think because for one, we can also look at what's happening, what other countries are doing, right? So, for instance, the U.S., which is directly involved in the
Mm-mm.
tensions because um, I mean, it's pretty much self-explanatory, you know. I mean, Nancy Pelosi visited, and now there are more lawmakers who are visiting, and China sees that as a provocation, so they're directly involved. And they're also one of Taiwan's most important security partners now.
Yeah.
Even there, even the U.S. is still keeping its one China policy.
Mm.
Um, I think if anything, um, what people want to see an end to, or what countries rather would want to see an end to, is the aggressive use of force, right?
Yeah.
Because it's, well, who wants who wants the
Yeah.
possibility of military confrontation, in
Yeah.
their backyard, or
Mm-mm.
just to happen anywhere in the world? Because
Yes.
as the war in Ukraine has showed, and as the pandemic showed, it really affects everybody. But on the one China policy itself, I don't think that um it'll see its end anytime
Yeah.
soon. Because even with what's happening right now currently, um no country has signaled breaking away from that, not even the US, which is again
Uh,
in that. And I think there's more to lose, because if you think about what would
yeah.
happen, right? Were that to come to an end, the risks would outweigh any would outweigh the benefits, at least at this point
Yeah.
in time.
Yeah.
So I was
So
wondering,
parang
yeah.
countries are maybe there will be a countries will learn to better do a balancing act. Ah,
Hmm.
siguro no.
Hmm.
Pero
Or even
ano no? Oh yeah. Okay, go ahead.
because even when it was even when countries abided by the one China policy,
Yeah.
no. So for example, let's look at the Philippines, for example. Interesting din yung case ng well, interesting to me because yeah, yeah, it's their context now. But then it's outlined, the way we practice that one China policy is outlined in two executive orders under former President Cory Aquino. So we established relationships, we established ties, formal ties with China under the presidency of Ferdinand E. Marcos. We were one of the first countries to establish ties with China, and it further that policy was further clarified under former President Cory Aquino, where she laid out that okay, who specifically is not allowed to visit. Um,
Mm.
the president, the vice president, secretary of foreign affairs, and the secretary of
Mm.
defense. So in terms of let's say what I mean it's pretty clear what that would look like, right, for us.
Mm.
So it means that these four officials can't visit. What about members of Congress? They actually do have another there's actually another specific provision for that, which they say, well, if any other government officials who visit China must do so without using the diplomatic passport if they
Mm.
had one. um
Okay.
if they had one, and shouldn't be and should it should be they should give notice to the
Mm.
DFA.
Okay.
So there are those mechanisms in place now. So in terms of the Philippines itself also um ending or in terms of the Philippines itself abiding by that, it's pretty there are rules set, or there are
Uh-uh.
criteria set, and there are those kinds of like guardrails in place so that you understand, so officials understand, and both sides understand what to expect from each other.
Mm. I
Mm-hmm.
think now ang lingering question, no, paano maapektuhan ang Asia and also specifically the Philippines sa nangyayaring gulo na heightened tension between Taiwan and China?
Mm-hmm.
What's the
Yeah.
immediate impact? Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, Asia definitely. So Asia first, no. The Asia definitely will
Yeah.
be affected. I think. So a lot of countries spoke out and expressed concern, over the live fire exercises, which were unprecedented because, um, it was the. I mean, it was a largest exercises, if I'm not mistaken, and it took place in several areas surrounding Taiwan, a few of which were crossing into areas which China recognizes as its territorial waters. No, so territorial waters is like 12 nautical miles from the coastline, and so you can just imagine that. I mean, it's not far. No, it's near. It's quite near actually. So in
Yeah.
terms of how would it affect Asia? Taiwan is near the location of Taiwan is also near the Philippines and Japan, right? And Japan was, I think, the most forceful to speak out, had the
Mm.
strongest statement because um 5 missiles that were launched in line with those exercises landed in waters that are part of its exclusive economic zone, and they found that to be um a serious security concern. Um and for the and, sorry, they found it to be a very
Yeah.
serious security concern. That's where Japan was coming from. In terms of the Philippines, um, yes, I mean, Philippines and Taiwan aren't we're neighbors, right? And
Yeah.
you can see Taiwan from parts of Batanes, and you can see
Yes.
again parts of the Philippines also from Taiwan, and so
Yeah.
um in terms of if there were to be any spillover, I mean, the likelihood that Philippines would be affected is could be quite high.
Yeah.
The Philippines is also a defense partner of the US, right? And so we have several defense agreements, one of which allows the US access to um, some military bases. And so
Mm.
I think the tensions are also I mean, the fact that that these tensions are happening, or it's happening at the time when the Philippines and US are also clarifying or further clarifying what they expect from each other if something like this were to happen or to blow up into a bigger um conflict. And so that's how the Philippines would be affected as well. And when it comes to other countries in the region, I think that um again, no, going back to some of the lessons some of the things we've seen because of COVID and because of the war in Ukraine, just because things happen in one part of the world doesn't mean that it's
Yeah.
just going to stay
Yeah.
there, right?
Yeah.
It's really going to affect. not just whichever countries are directly involved in the conflict, but even neighboring countries. So it could potentially affect um, shipping. It potentially affect also air travel, and so those are some of the ways that Asia would be affected, no, and Philippines in particular.
So, so now we know the possibilities, the possible impact. Paano dapat responde or ano dapat action ng gobyerno ng Pilipinas sa nangyayaring gulo, no? Is neutrality the way to go?
Hmm. No, I don't think it's so much neutrality, no.
Yeah.
So as it is a delicate response, as diplomats would describe it, is needed. And I think that delicate response looks like, I mean, it kind of it it looks a little bit how it looks like now in terms of the Philippines, no?
Mm-hmm.
So um it's clear that, so from the short statement that the Department of Foreign Affairs said, which I'll read, um they said the Philippines is concerned with rising tensions in the Taiwan Strait just north of the Philippines. The Philippines adheres to the One China policy. The Philippines
Mm-hmm.
urges restraint by all parties concerned. Diplomacy and dialogue must prevail. It's just four sentences.
Okay.
2, 3, 4. Yes, correct. Tama. Just making sure I counted that right. Yeah, it's just four sentences. But then here we can see that so the Philippines is clear that it stands by um international law, and that you should not use force
Mm-hmm.
to um assert your claims, that it prizes and prioritizes dialogue over anything, over, again, the use of force. And I think in saying, and I think in mentioning those things, no, um some people might view it as neutrality, but then um I mean, the way that I would view it is that we are standing by those principles, no, the rule of law, and that peaceful dialogue must prevail over the use of force. And so, while
Mm-hmm.
people may want a more explicit statement, for instance, I don't think that's going to be coming anytime soon, because
Yeah.
um yeah, that's the most measured response you could have right now. So I think, not I don't think neutrality is the way to go. I think that by sticking to what the Philippines holds as its values, no, so rule of law, following international law, that's the way to go right now, at least. I think also it's worth mentioning rin, no, that especially under the new Secretary Enrique Manalo. He said that the DFA would always give studied responses, and would not react out of emotion, or due
Yeah.
to false, or due to fake news. So just by that statement alone, no, um, that gives us an idea of how the Philippines would respond. And I think also, you it's more than that. It's important to condemn what's happening, no, and
Mm-hmm.
which we saw naman in the statement so far.
Yeah. So, I know baka we're getting ahead of ourselves. You mentioned four paragraphs or four sentences, yung statement so far ng Philippines sa nangyayaring tension. Pero, I wanted to ask you, scenario building tayo, no? Now, what if, for example, we continue to abide by those, like, the principle of diplomacy and one China policy? Ano yung mangyayari? Ano yung possible outcome? Versus if we, like, consistently condemn, like, explicitly and strongly condemn yung nangyayari. Uh, Kasi of course, 'di ba, isipin natin, if China can do it, China is doing it to Taiwan, yung military ano, what's keeping them from doing it to our
Mhm,
territories, 'di ba? So, ano
mhm,
yung dalawang scenarios na nakikita mo dito na siguro two extremes scenarios
mhm,
na nakikita mo?
mhm. Well, I think the funny thing as well, Nodulas, is that if anything, um, this is teaching I mean, this particular issue is showing that you can't stay on the extremes, no. You have to find common ground, and that wouldn't be staying out of it. The Philippines can't stay out of it
Yeah.
entirely, because um again, of all the reasons I listed earlier. Also, we have nearly 200,000, around 175, almost 200,000 OFWs in Taiwan, no. So That's a direct concern as well. Um,
Mm-mm.
and and I think also um, by by yeah, so can't if anything we can't have an extreme response. No? You can't stay in the extremes. You have to have a more we have to have a more measured response, which is also what we're
Mm.
seeing from our diplomats. And if we consistently condemn what's happening, which we have released one statement so far, and should tensions continue, I would expect that perhaps more statements would be released. No, it's important to consistently condemn what's happening, because then you well it's supposed it hopefully will aid in lowering the tensions. No,
Mm.
because if you stay out of it, and if you don't condemn, or you don't call out, or you don't call out actions that are unacceptable, or you don't call for dialogue, it shows that you accept what's happening,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And if you accept what's happening, then you embolden those actors who are taking aggressive actions, and that will just lead to, I mean, what will that lead to exactly? Like
Yes.
it would be difficult and hard to imagine the effects of what that would lead to.
Yes, silence is complicity,
Mhm.
as we've discovered, and as we've learned over the decades, the centuries of war. For my last question, Sophia, of course we've talked about the response of the diplomatic community, the government, but then for ordinary Filipinos, no, like outside, like our families, our neighbors, our communities, why should they care about what's happening in Taiwan, the challenges that Taiwanese people are facing in while they're under threat from China? Bakit
Mhm.
kailangan may pakialam sila at bakit kailangan bantayan nila yung nangyayari?
Mhm. Mhm. Well, yung tension sa Taiwan may implications din sa ating lahat, 'di ba? It shows us how China will behave in the region, no? Taiwan is primary national interest to China. It's first, if not, I mean, it's pretty much almost first priority among its first priorities. And so while Taiwan is what is center stage right now, it doesn't mean that issues like the South China Sea will go away, or its actions in other places in the world will go away. No, if anything, it reflects how China will behave, and we've seen that it's not afraid to use force. It also is able to deploy um, uh, economic responses to what's happening in Taiwan. So they just a brief mention. No, they also um, place some sanctions on Taiwan. Then it allows some of its imports to come in.
Mm-mm.
And the Philippines has economic ties to China, of course, and so we're learning lessons as to what China could do should conflict escalate closer to home here
Yeah.
in the Philippines. Also, again, as I mentioned, we have Filipinos who are living in China, and again, 200, around 200,000 OFWs, and again, all of this really um, is has an impact now on the rule of law, which as a country, the Philippines really depends on. We depend on the rule of law to be able to um, stake our place in the world, and if that is weakened, then it also weakens our
Yeah.
position. Um, it also weakens our position later on, not just in issues like the West Philippine Sea, but in um, how we put ourselves and how we position ourselves in the world. And so those are some of the reasons why Filipinos should care about, no. Of course, we also mentioning the fact na kung maging mas malala pa yung tension dun, then it could also spill over into us in the Philippines.
Yeah. Parang napakadaming nuances ng relationship ng China and Taiwan, nung conflict, yung na-root siya sa historical context talaga. But yung nangyayaring tensions, yung pagiging aggressive ng China, it has real life impact on the citizens of Taiwan, and also eventually it can mirror, as you said, it can mirror what China can do to other countries, specifically to the Philippines. So napakadaming discussion dapat dito, no, para sa ating mga viewers na gusto sumali sa discussion tungkol sa conflict sa Taiwan or kahit anong issue sa Pilipinas, sa ating mga neighboring countries. Pwede kayo sumali sa Facebook group ng Rappler. Ang pangalan ay Rappler Room. Search lang yung pangalan nito sa Facebook or i-click niyo yung link sa comment section ng video na to. Maraming salamat, Sofia, for explaining to us the situation na nangyayari ngayon at yung impact ng Taiwan and China's conflict sa Pilipinas, as well as yung so mention kanina yung yung dapat careful na response dito dahil as you mentioned nga, when you're silent, it means complicity, it means what is happening is okay with you, and that shouldn't happen, as we've learned over the years.
Mhm.
And for our viewers, thank you for watching. Kung gusto niyo sundan ng issue na to, huwag kalimutan na palagi bisitahin ang Rappler website. Don't forget to also like and subscribe na sa YouTube ng Rappler, pati na rin sa aming social media accounts tulad ng Facebook at Twitter. Meron din kami TikTok account na pwede niyong bisitahin kung gusto niyo naman panoorin ng mga short explainers on various issues in the Philippines. Samahan niyo ulit kami next week para sa bagong episode. Ako si Judas Gavilan at ito ang Newsbreak Beyond the Stories.